It's great to see everybody here this morning. One of the reasons why I watch the news is not because I think there's really a whole lot in this world worth watching, but because there's always good sermon material out there. And you'll see what I mean about halfway through our lesson, a recent news event, or rather an ongoing series of news events that inspired what I wanted to talk about today. Have your Bibles open to Acts chapter 19 at this time, and we're going to notice the story that takes place here in Ephesus, in Acts chapter 19. Now, a little bit of background information if you're not familiar with this story, or you're not familiar with its place in the book of Acts. The Apostle Paul has been in the city of Ephesus, one of the greatest cities in the world at the time, a place of commerce, of incredibly high culture and education. It was also the location of the temple of Artemis, one of the gods in the Greek and Roman pantheon, otherwise known as Diana. So he was in Ephesus preaching for about 2 years, at least 2 years, it says in Acts chapter 19 and verse 10, to all those who lived in Asia. They heard the word of the Lord, both Jews and Greeks. It goes on to describe the great miracles and wonders that were being done by Paul, by the power of Jesus Christ in Ephesus, to the point where people only had to bring handkerchiefs and simply touch them to the body of the Apostle Paul, and people would be healed. Of course, you have this interesting story of the 7 sons of Sceva, who was a Jewish priest, coming in and trying to heal a man of his demon. And in verses 14 through 16, you see the interesting event there where this demon-possessed man sends these 7 sons of Sceva running away, wounded and naked. It says in verse 17 of Acts 19, "This became known to all, both Jews and Greeks who lived in Ephesus. Fear fell upon them all, and the name of the Lord Jesus was being magnified. Many also of those who had believed kept coming, confessing and disclosing their practices. Many of those who practiced magic brought their books together and began burning them in the sight of all. And they counted up the price of them and found it 50,000 pieces of silver." Now, I just mentioned news in the intro to this lesson. You don't have to live in the 21st century for news to travel fast. And even if you lived in Ephesus in the 1st century, you'd better believe that if a great number of your population in the city showed up in the city square to burn their books of magic and sorcery, you'd better believe that the whole town knew what was going on. And if a great number of your population was converting to this new, strange religion called Christianity, in some places they would have called it that, then you'd better believe everybody would have known. And if there was this odd, quirky man named Paul who seemed to have the magic ability to heal people of their illnesses, you'd better believe that you would have heard of that. And if the local economy centered around the temple of Artemis was being adversely affected by all of these strange events, you'd better believe you would have heard of that too. Which brings us to our text in Acts 19 and verse 23. About that time there arose no small disturbance concerning the way. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, was bringing no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen of similar trades and said, "Men, you know that our prosperity depends upon this business. And you see and you hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with silver are no gods at all. And not only is there danger that this trade of ours will fall into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and she whom all of Asia and the world worship should even be dethroned from her magnificence." So in verse 28, when they heard this, they were filled with rage, and they began crying out, saying, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Some things to think about here as we get going. Who was Artemis? What was her place in Ephesus? According to Antipater of Sidon, who's probably most well known for coming up with the most common list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, in 140 BC, Antipater had this to say about the temple of Artemis, again, otherwise known as Diana in other pantheons. He says, "I have set eyes upon the wall of lofty Babylon, on which lies a chariot road, and the statue of Zeus by the Alpheus, and the hanging gardens, and the colossus of the sun, and the huge labor of the high pyramids, and the vast tomb of Mausolus. But when I saw the temple of Artemis, which rose to the clouds, these other marvels lost their brilliance, and I exclaimed, Lo, apart from Olympus, the sun has never looked upon aught so grand." That was the temple of Artemis that the Ephesians favored and cherished and loved so very much. It was what gave them purpose in their city. Now, Ephesus was an important harbor city in its time. It was a place of commerce and trade and politics, but it was most known for the temple of Artemis. It was the center of their religion. It was the center of their purpose. It was the center of their cultural and social identity. That was what they were known for all around the world. When I say Anaheim, California, what do you think of? Disneyland, right? Now, you don't think there are some other things in Anaheim, California, as well as Disneyland? Other things, other attractions, other places, other people who probably roll their eyes whenever they hear the term Disneyland because it causes traffic and pollution. But you know what we know Anaheim for? It's Disneyland. That's what Artemis was to Ephesus. It was the grand tourist attraction of its time for that city. Not only that, but they considered the Ephesian Artemis to be even a slightly distinct god from the regular Artemis. What I mean by that is that, according to one writer, the Ephesians considered her to be theirs. And they resented any foreign claims to her protection. Artemis was their god. Now, there might have been other forms of Artemis in other places around the Roman world, but Artemis, the Ephesian Artemis, was their distinctive, special god. Under Hellenic rule and under Roman rule, the Ephesian Artemis festival was increasingly promoted as a most significant cultural event. It was part of a definitively Greek political and cultural identity, and it was essential to the economic life of the region. And an excellent economy, or an excellent opportunity, by the way, for young unmarried Greeks to seek out marriage partners when they came together for the festival. There were games, there were contests, there were theatrical performances that were held in the goddess's name, which certainly gives one explanation why in the city of Ephesus there was a theater that could hold over 25,000 people, which we'll talk about that theater in a little while when it comes into play in this story in Acts chapter 19. Of course, with all this interest in Artemis and her temple, this is all that exists of her temple today. Where has Artemis gone? Where have her followers gone? Where have her worshipers gone? They have abandoned one of the 7 wonders of the world to the tides of time. That single column, by the way, is not one column. It's the pieces from multiple columns. They couldn't even find, when they were digging up the ruins of the Temple of Artemis, they could not even find the pieces for one single column. They had to cobble together parts from other columns to just make that one. Where has Artemis gone? Where has she gone? Artemis, again, otherwise known as Diana, was a huntress god, though in Ephesus she was known more as a fertility god. That explains the shirt of eggs that surround her chest. Some would consider those to be breasts, but I think many historians have come to believe that it more represents eggs, like a shirt of eggs just representing fertility. Along her column, along her legs, you'll see the animals, the figures of animals all along there. Here's a closer view for you. because she was also considered the goddess of the hunt, the goddess of wild animals, the goddess of fertility. She was very closely associated with things like honeybees and flowers and oxen, deer, goats, and other kinds of wild animals that you would find. So let's keep reading here. Let's take a few moments to make some comments about what we noticed here in this city filled with confusion. I want to make a few comments about what Demetrius says. First of all, take note of the fact here that he comes right out and says to men of similar trades, you know that our prosperity depends on Artemis. Our prosperity depends on the business that we derive from the worship of Artemis, from tourists coming to this town to see the temple of Artemis. That's how we make our living. Now, of course, he's careful to point out here in verse 27 that the temple of the great goddess of Artemis might be regarded as worthless and that people would stop believing in her. But really, what's at the core of it? What's at the heart of his concern? Yeah, that's right, Paula. His main concern is not Artemis or the temple. His main concern is this. Great practical application about this. Often, there are two reasons that people are hostile to God and the gospel. There's the reason that they want you to believe, the reason that might seem more noble, more reasonable, more logical, more defined, and then there's the reason that they don't want you to believe, which is often the real reason. Demetrius wants this issue to be about Artemis because that is noble and it is selfless. And to other Ephesians, that's perfectly reasonable. Deep down, though, it's about losing business and standing in the community. We hear phrases like this today. When we present the gospel to somebody who's hostile, who's not receptive, we often hear things like, religion is just empty superstition. Well, that's easy to say, but is that really the reason why you don't want to believe that religion is just empty superstition? Science makes God obsolete. And again, that sounds like a very logical, reasonable excuse for not wanting to be religious, that science makes God obsolete. Religion is just the reason for heartache in human history. The Crusades, the witch hunts, the Spanish Inquisition. You know, I wonder, when people make this excuse, when have you ever given a lick of concern about the Crusades? I mean, when in your life were you ever kept up at night worrying about the Crusades or the Salem witch hunt? When did that ever keep you awake at night? That's not the real reason that you don't want to believe in Christ. That's not the real reason. More often than not, it boils down to, I just don't want to be told what to do. It boils down to, I like playing golf on Sundays. That's what it boils down to. They want you to believe that it's because of this high, noble, philosophical reason. But just like Demetrius, we don't want to see the temple of Artemis go into disrepute, the great goddess that we worship so much. But I'll tell you what, it's going to be hard to find a job as a silversmith in Ephesus if this keeps going on like this. There's the reason that he wants you to believe, and then there's the real reason why he's worried right now. You notice that when Demetrius wants to begin a conversation about the problems in Ephesus, right? By the way, people in the 21st century, we love using the word conversation. Millennials love, we want to start a conversation. We want to have a conversation about this moral issue or this ethical issue. People love conversations today. But isn't it interesting that when Demetrius wants to start the conversation about what's going on in Ephesus, who does he go to first? But the people who he knows will agree with him. He wants to gather his allies together. Be very careful that when you see a problem in society, whether it's politics or ethics or even a problem in the church, when you see a problem in front of you, be careful not to just rely upon the opinions of everyone who agrees with you. Be careful not to surround yourself with people who are just going to chant, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." You don't hear a second opinion. You don't get the other side of the story. You just get to hear from everybody else who already agrees with you. And he gets them all riled up. He gets them all riled up to where they start chanting. And that's not all. It's not just that they're chanting. Let's keep reading here. And the city, it says in verse 29, was filled with confusion. And they rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, people who you'll read about later on in the book of Acts and in some of Paul's epistles. These were Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. And when Paul wanted to go into the assembly, the disciples would not let him go. And also some of the Asiarchs in verse 31. These were religious or political officials in Asia. They were friends of his, and they sent to him and repeatedly urged him not to venture into the theater. So we come into the theater now, which of course is in the background of our screen up there. A beautiful theater, by the way, one of the largest of its time, the largest in Asia. 25,000 seats. Think about that. 25,000 seats. That's more people than can fit into the stadium where the Phoenix Suns play. And this crowd would gather together to watch plays and concerts as well as gladiatorial events. So they gathered together into the theater, and the reason why this is a significant thing to point out, first of all, is that it points out that this event took place in a real time, in a real place. And I love that about the Bible. You know, when you read the Bible, you're not reading about like Middle Earth or Narnia. You're not reading about made-up places. You're not reading about somewhere that took place in someone's imagination. When you read Acts chapter 19, you are reading about a place where you can go to this very day with a tour group. And you can stand in the middle of that theater, right where Demetrius was, riling up the crowd. And you can walk the streets of the ruins of Ephesus, just where Paul was, pleading with his friends to go into that temple so that he could rescue his traveling companions from this ravenous mob. And I love that the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, takes place in real places, in real time. But the second thing, perhaps the theater was the only place in town that could hold a crowd big enough that had gathered together. I don't know how big this mob was, but the fact that this theater could seat 25,000 people and that they chose that as the place where they would get together. Not some city square, not a field on the edge of town, but a 25,000 seat theater. Now, I'm not saying that this mob was literally 25,000 people. I'm just saying this mob must have been a very large mob in order for that to be the location that they picked to get together. Is it inconceivable to say that 1,000 Ephesians gathered together? 10,000? 20,000? Ephesus was a big city for its time. And even though Paul had been working hard here for 2 years to preach the gospel, I find it very unbelievable that the majority of the population of Ephesus had converted to Christianity. It might have been only a handful, a small percentage of the townfolk that believed in Christ. So you have still tens of thousands who believe in Artemis. This was not a small group of people that got together. What started as Demetrius and a few of his friends in the silversmith guild turned into a real, legitimate mob. And they want blood. They want blood. They wouldn't let Paul go into the theater because they knew they'd rip him to pieces, limb from limb. I like in verse 31 that the Asiarchs try to stop Paul. The writer Luke notes that these Asiarchs were friends of his. I think it's good to see that Paul had a very diverse group of friends. When he preached in Ephesus, he would have been exposed as a preacher to a lot of different people. Ephesus was a place where people came and went. It was a travel stop. It was a place of commerce and trade. It was a religious center. Ephesus was so famous for its beauty, its buildings, its structures, and the temple of Artemis, that whenever a Roman emperor would first become emperor, his first pit stop would be Ephesus. That's a point that's made in Roman history, that every new emperor made it a point to go to Ephesus to visit that city. That's how famous this city was. So as Paul is preaching in the streets and preaching in people's homes, and hey, maybe one of those days he got to preach in the theater, preaching in the school of Tyrannus, there are people from all over the Roman world passing through Ephesus, meeting Paul and befriending Paul as well. See, he's got some important friends, some powerful friends, some significant friends. Pick up in verse 32 now. So then, some were shouting one thing, and some were shouting another, for the assembly was in confusion, and the majority did not know for what cause they had come together. It's one of my favorite verses, by the way, on protesting. Now, I love living in the United States of America, and I love living in this time period, and I love that we are guaranteed the right to peaceful protest. But you know what? It's not always a very useful tool, right? We're guaranteed that right, and people love to express it, and people love to use that right. But that doesn't mean it's always useful. It doesn't mean it's always effective. It doesn't mean that people always really know why they've gathered together. You know what? Sometimes people are just mad. Sometimes people are just mad. They don't know why they're mad, and they don't have any idea what they think should happen to make their anger go away. But they're just mad. And in the same way that you wonder, why would Demetrius think that protesting in the theater is ever going to change people's minds about religion? You sometimes wonder, like, what does turning over police cars and throwing Molotov cocktails through the window of a Radio Shack do to change anything in the United States of America? Since when did that ever change anybody's minds? They burned a Walgreens to the ground. I think you make a strong point. This mob had gathered together, and most of them didn't even know why they were there. Pitchforks? Sure, honey, get the torch. We're going mobbing. And there was so much confusion that some people were shouting one thing and other people were shouting another thing. They had no idea why they were there or why they were angry. All they knew was that this Demetrius fellow sure knew how to rile up a crowd. So in verse 33, some of the crowd concluded that it was Alexander, since the Jews had put him forward. And having motioned with his hand, Alexander was intending to make a defense to the assembly. And there's different interpretations of this, but I think what's going on is that the local Jewish community had sent a representative to this mob, just so a representative could make it clear, this Paul guy is not affiliated with us in any way. Just so you guys know, you're mad at Paul. Please understand, we are not affiliated with Paul or anybody who's following the Nazarene. I think that's what Alexander wants to convey. He wants to make some kind of a defense to them of, just please don't take this out of the synagogue. Don't burn our synagogue to the ground because you're mad at Paul. But it says in verse 34, when they recognized that he was a Jew, because remember, to most Gentiles, to most Romans and Greeks, they didn't see a definition between Christians and Jews. They believed that Christianity was just some other form of Judaism, just an offshoot of Judaism or a subset of Judaism. So when they saw Alexander, who was a Jew, they didn't see any kind of difference between what he would have said and what Paul would have said. So when they saw that he was a Jew, a single outcry arose from them all as they shouted for about 2 hours. Think about that. For 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And for 2 hours, shouting the same thing. Now they go from confusion where nobody knows why they're there and everybody's saying one thing or another to suddenly being unified, and all it took was Alexander to show up and raise his hand, and they all had a purpose then. They all had a purpose then. For 2 hours. And what did it accomplish? Well, their voices were probably hoarse by the end of it. Maybe a Roman representative back at his tax office took note of what was going on and started to pen a little letter. He called a horseman out and said, let's get the postal service on this one. I've got a message that you need to send to headquarters because these crazy Greeks here in Ephesus, they're up to trouble right now. And what was the one thing that Romans hated more than anything else? Trouble, mischief, public outcries. The Romans loved peace and quiet in the provinces. After quieting the multitude down in verse 35, the town clerk said, Men of Ephesus, what man is there after all who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of the image which fell down from heaven? That's what their estimation was of Artemis, and her image was that she had fallen down from Jupiter. She'd fallen down from heaven, that she came to us from the gods themselves and serves as our God, our patroness of the town. Since then, these are undeniable facts. Really? Undeniable facts, huh? Now, I suppose he could be saying that it is an undeniable fact that Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of Artemis, and I suppose he'd be right about that. But is it an undeniable fact that the image of Artemis had come to them all the way from heaven? You know, when you compare the undeniable facts of Jesus to the undeniable facts of Artemis, one of them doesn't measure up. Jesus, who was a real human being, attested by secular history, Roman history, as well as Jewish history, a man who lived a life unspotted by sin, a man who had witness after witness after witness attest to the things that he did in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as well as others, and a man who left behind an undeniably empty tomb, a tomb that even his enemies had no excuse for, versus Artemis, who nobody ever saw come down from heaven, Artemis, who was nothing but a statue as far as anybody could tell, Artemis, whose followers were so fickle that they could even be converted away from her, and Artemis, whose main concern apparently is the business of the silversmiths making little tiny shrines for her for them to take home. One of them doesn't measure up as far as undeniable facts go. One of them doesn't measure up. You ought to keep calm and to do nothing rash. And again, what's the main concern? Is his main concern Artemis? Or in verse 37, for you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of our goddess. I love that the Christians in that community, Paul and his traveling companions, they never argued with anybody. They never tore anybody down. They never insulted it. They never insulted Artemis. In spite of the fact that Artemis was probably an easy target, they never insulted or demeaned Artemis or her followers. They simply reasoned with them. They taught the gospel. And teaching the gospel is not making fun of people. Teaching the gospel is not insulting people. So the town clerk says, these guys haven't done anything wrong. Now maybe you don't like the fact that they're preaching something that's different. Maybe you don't like the fact that people in Ephesus are following them. But they have not robbed a temple, and they have not technically blasphemed Artemis. So then, if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have a complaint against any man, the courts are in session, and proconsuls are available. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you want anything beyond this, it shall be settled in the lawful assembly. For indeed, in verse 40, we're in danger of being accused of a riot in connection with today's affair, since there's no real cause for it. And in this connection, we shall be unable to account for this disorderly gathering. The town clerk is pleading with them. let's not get so rash that the Romans have to come in with a legion or two and deal with us. We've got a pretty sweet gig here. We make a lot of money from these silver shrines. We make a lot of money from tourism. The Romans like us. Let's not ruin all this over a piddly little religious question, shall we? So again, just like Demetrius, there's two reasons, right? One that he wants them to believe, one that is the truth. Of course they don't want Artemis to be blasphemed. They don't want Artemis to lose her standing in the pantheon of gods. But just like Demetrius is worried about business and money, the town clerk is worried about keeping the peace. That's his job as town clerk, is to make sure that Ephesus runs smoothly and quietly for the sake of the Romans, for the sake of the locals, for the sake of the tourists who want to come to Ephesus and buy their little bobblehead of Artemis. You know, just like when you go to the Washington Monument, everybody's got to find the little brass Washington Monument statue. Or you go to the Lincoln Memorial. Or you go see a baseball game and you got to get the bobblehead. That was me shaking the bobblehead. People want to come see Artemis. And they want to get a souvenir while they're there. And they don't want to have to deal with riots and mobs. And after saying this, he dismissed the assembly, and that was that. And just as easily as people can get riled up, their emotions die down, and they go home. And nothing has really changed. Now Artemis is gone. And her temple, as you saw earlier, was nothing but a few stones on top of one another. What stands today is Jesus Christ. He's the house, the temple, that's being built up in His church today. We are a testament to the very gospel that Paul was preaching in Ephesus. We are the next brick that has been laid in that great and grand structure of God's in this world. It is a structure, a temple not made with hands. It is a temple that has touched every culture, in every language, on every continent, for almost 2,000 years now. And I can say with the greatest confidence that if God allows this world to continue for another 2,000 years, there will still be Christians on the face of this earth proclaiming the same message. If you want to be a part of that, if you'd like to become a Christian, now is your opportunity to become a part of the greatest endeavor in human history, which is to preach the world to all creation, to teach them how to become disciples, to baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit for entrance into that kingdom, and to be saved for all eternity. Now, if you'd like to obey at this time, please come forward as we stand and sing.